Hi everyone, my name is Steve Flanders, and I'm a Solutions Architect on the vCenter Log Insight product team at VMware. And I'd like to discuss how to deploy vCenter Log Insight 2.0 GA. Log Insight ships as a virtual appliance, and so you deploy it like any other virtual appliance in your environment. What I have up for you currently is the vSphere web client to my vCenter server instance, and I've gone ahead and selected the option to deploy an OVF template. I'll now go ahead and browse for the OVA file that I have downloaded from the VMware download site and select Open, and then select Next. Now, one new thing that you'll notice with the Log Insight 2.0 GA version is that there's now a warning when you deploy a new OVA as extra configuration options are enabled in the virtual appliance. More specifically, this keyboard type min delay option, which should alleviate any latencies that you see when you use the console of the Log Insight virtual appliance. Now, you shouldn't really have a need to use the console, but if you are in a situation where you may have some sort of network issue in your environment, the console is very helpful, and having a repeating keyboard issue makes it a little bit harder to use the product. So you have to select the option here to allow this extra configuration and then select Next. Of course, go ahead and read through and accept the EULA for Log Insight and select Next. Give your virtual machine a name and specify the location where you want it to be deployed. Select Next. And then you have different sizing options available to you depending on what you anticipate your ingestion rate being for your Log Insight environment. Now, the default option is this small option, which is the minimal recommended configuration for a production Log Insight instance. There is a smaller option available, but it's really only intended for proof of concept or test environments and should not be used in production. So you'll see here the small, it will go ahead and set specific CPU, memory, and storage allocations based on the configuration that I select. And you can also see an approximation on how many events per second, how much local retention will be necessary to support this configuration. Next up, I specify where I want to store the virtual appliance, and I can of course select my disk format as well. In the case of NFS, most often you only have the thin provision option available to you, but for local data stores and for Fiber Channel, you do have the ability of specifying a thick provision. And usually it's recommended to select the thick provision because it's very normal for the Log Insight virtual appliance to have a full virtual disk, because we are storing events on this virtual appliance and they will get rotated out on a first in, first out type basis. So it's perfectly natural for the virtual appliance to be relatively full. So there's no real benefit to the thin provision. It may make sense for a proof of concept or demo perspective because there's really no performance difference between thin and thick. I mean, it's very, very minor. But still, I would recommend using thick in your production environments if the option is available to you. Next up is networking, where you get to select your port group that you want to connect to. And then the most important aspect would be customizing the template, or more specifically, OVF properties. Now, this is important because this is the only supported way to set networking information for the Log Insight virtual appliance. Things like you see here being hostname, IP address, netmask, gateway, and DNS information. Now, of course, the virtual appliance is just running SUSE, or Linux-based operating system, and you could make changes on the virtual appliance itself, but just note that those changes may be overwritten during a reboot. So if you want them to persist, if you want them to be set properly, you do that here through OVF properties. And even after you've deployed the virtual appliance, you can power it down, edit the settings of it, and modify these settings as necessary. If you're in a demo or POC environment, you may select to use DHCP, but using static information is the recommended way, the best practice for deploying this in a production environment. One other option now available in Log Insight 2.0 GA is the ability of setting the root password for the Log Insight virtual appliance during deployment time. This is nice because, as you may recall, SSH to the virtual appliance is disabled by default because the root password is blank. So in versions 1.x, you'd have to actually open up the console of the virtual appliance after you deployed it, and you would have to go ahead and set the root password, which would enable SSH for you. Now you have the ability of going ahead and setting a root password during deployment time, and then you will not have to use the console, and SSH will be enabled for you. So in this particular example, I'll do a DHCP configuration. I will go ahead and set the root password. I'll select Next. You'll see it gives me a nice summary information of everything that it's going to do. And in my case, I do want it to power on. When it's done, I'll select Finish. And now my virtual appliance is being deployed into my environment. Once this is done, the virtual machine will power on, and it will go through its first boot process, which takes a couple of minutes. And when everything's done, it will actually reboot the virtual appliance one more time just to get everything applied properly. When it's done, all other interactions with the product are done through the HTML5 interface. I'll be covering configuration in the next video that I put up, but for now, just note that you would see a splash screen for this virtual machine when it's complete, which would give you the IP, or if you have the FQDN configured, the URL that you would need to connect to in order to go ahead and use the product. So that concludes this video demonstration of Login Site 2.0 GA and how to actually deploy the virtual appliance. I'd encourage you to go ahead and take a look at my blog, sflanders.net, as I have a lot of good information there on Login Site, or feel free to follow me on Twitter. My handle is smflanders. Thank you very much.